Welcome to our next episode. We are talking about how trauma can hold women back from their fitness goals and what to do about it. Every time I've had this conversation about trauma and fitness, it's gone over very well. So hopefully you will have the same experience. So if you have a history of trauma and are struggling with these few things, this episode may be quite relevant for you. Number one, if you have a deep resistance to working out, you know that you want to work out, but you struggle with the consistency, you struggle with the motivation, and again, there's almost this deep, unexplainable resistance to it. This episode might be relevant for you if that is the case. Number two, if you have body image issues, so if you beat yourself up mentally, if you're very self-critical, this episode absolutely will be relevant for you. Number three, if you see exercise as a form of punishment, or if you just have a poor association with exercise and diet, this episode will absolutely be relevant for you. And lastly, if you experience weird or unexplainable symptoms when you work out, maybe you feel more anxiety or stress when you exercise, or even if you start to dissociate, particularly when you do more intense exercise, this episode will definitely be relevant for you. So, this is the Feminine Strength Podcast. We share innovative strategies here for women to sustainably build a strong and fit body while supporting their hormonal health and their nervous system resilience, which is why we're talking about trauma today. I am your host, Jess Mather. I'm a strength and rehab professional with over 14 years of experience working with people all around the world to help them get stronger, healthier, happier, and safer in their body. So let's talk about trauma. So, trauma became a bit of a buzzword. I want to say back in 2020, when we went through a global pandemic, people started talking more about trauma. The book, The Body Keeps the Score, became very popularized during that time, which is a really quite deep and heavy book about trauma. And more people were starting to understand how trauma can impact their lives in many different ways. I started learning about trauma a couple years prior. In 2018, I went to pursue somatic experiencing, which is a trauma training founded by Peter Levine. And that was my first introduction to formal trauma training. Although prior, for about 6 years prior, I was already working with a lot of traumatized individuals in physical therapy, particularly this one clinic in North Orlando. We got a lot of patients that were coming from poverty, even some homelessness. Some of my patients, they had suffered from violent domestic abuse or mental illness. Many of the patients were coming in with traumatic physical accidents, of course, that we were rehabbing them from, and also medical traumas. So many people coming in with a lot of trauma that I actually felt quite ill-equipped to work with because there was so much trauma and it was impacting the work that we were doing in physical therapy. I also was seeing clients in my private practice, and they had more emotional or sexual abuse. And I was starting to see patterns in the way that trauma was starting to manifest in them, both physically and psychologically. So I got training in somatic experiencing and continue another fast forward 5 years later. I worked with many other mentors in trauma, many more clients, and I actually created a course called the Chronic Pain and Trauma Curriculum. And I mention this just because sometimes trauma can feel a little bit fluffy and elusive when we talk about trauma. Again, it's a buzzword. There's a lot of information out there on trauma, but I really went through the weeds and through the research to one, get the training and then also create a curriculum around trauma, in particular in the context of movement and also in chronic pain. So if you're somebody listening who has a history of trauma and suffers from chronic pain, just know that that is very normal. There are a lot of connections between chronic pain and trauma, and perhaps on a future episode, we will talk about those relationships and how pain can be a manifestation of trauma. I point all of this out again because there are so many ways that trauma is relevant in the context of fitness, although we don't usually see it that way. We actually got this content accredited about trauma and pain. So there is a lot of evidence behind this work as well. So let's first define trauma. Let's define trauma. Sometimes can be tricky to define trauma because trauma is not just an event. We can say, oh, this was a traumatic event, but I always loved Gabor Mate's definition of trauma. He's a trauma researcher and a former physician, and he would say trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of that event, essentially. So how did we internalize that event? That determines whether it is a traumatic experience because we can all experience things differently. What could be traumatizing for one person might not be traumatizing for another. It depends on our unique makeup. It depends on previous traumas. It depends on our current stress level. It depends on unconscious or even conscious beliefs about what happened during that event. And most importantly, we see in the trauma research is whether somebody will experience something as a traumatic event depends a lot on whether that person had support or what Peter Levine calls an empathetic witness. Did you have an empathetic witness when you experienced that trauma? Did you have support, ideally, before in your life, during, and after that event? Then typically that event won't be experienced as strongly as trauma versus somebody who felt helpless. What was really neat, the most hopeful about the research that I did in trauma and the teaching that I've done in trauma is that most people recover well from trauma. Most people actually do recover well from trauma. Very, very hopeful way to put it. But what do we mean by recover? Recover from trauma. We often hear the phrase heal from trauma. We see that everywhere. I'm going to heal you from your trauma. What does that even mean? One of my teachers would say that trauma never really goes away. It's still with us. It still happened to you. We can't delete it from ourselves. And often that trauma helped shape us to who we are today. The trauma happened, similar to if you had an injury. The injury happened, right? It's there, it happened. We might have a scar from that injury. We might occasionally feel some pain or discomfort from that injury or trauma. But healing has occurred. We have recovered some. It's not an open wound that's now vulnerable and sensitive or something we're always trying to protect from getting reopened, but it doesn't mean it completely goes away. And I think that's a really realistic way to look at trauma because often when we're looking at healing trauma, we want to just pretend like it never happened and get over it as if that never happened to us. But a more balanced approach is that happened to me and I can move forward. So there can also be a range in which we're impacted by our traumas. We can be severely impacted by our traumas, perhaps somebody who gets diagnosed with PTS or PTSD, where they're really impacted by their traumas and they are needing to go get support from a psychologist. But then also people who have trauma don't have to be necessarily diagnosed with PTS in order for their life to be severely impacted. And I think that's an important thing to note as well. Just because you don't fall into a diagnosis of PTS doesn't mean that trauma is not impacting your life. It's really, really important to note. So trauma can be a major singular event. It can be something like a divorce, a life-threatening physical accident that I was often seeing with my PT patients. Trauma can also be a series of chronic stressors or an accumulation of stressors. Childhood trauma falls into this category. Typically, trauma is also experienced as a feeling of helplessness or powerlessness. When we've experienced immense powerlessness, which often unfortunately happens when we're children, that typically leads to more residual impacts later on because we were completely helpless in that situation. So when we internalize a trauma, we can experience a dysregulation of the nervous system, of the autonomic nervous system. We can be living in a state of survival, is one way that it's put. So there can be either hyperarousal, we're really more activated, or a hypoarousal, which is going to be more of that freeze or shutdown state you might be familiar with. In a healthy nervous system, we're able to toggle between the states of sympathetic and parasympathetic, this upregulation or arousal in sympathetic, and parasympathetic is this downregulation and this slowing down. So in a healthy nervous system, even if you are about to get into a car accident and there's stress hormones flood your system and you go into the sympathetic activation, that you're able to recover from that. You're able to regulate. Your body naturally will regulate. You'll take a deep sigh. You'll orient around your surroundings. You'll maybe shake off some energy, and then you're able to regulate. So that's a healthy nervous system, and a regulated nervous system has that capacity to toggle between these states. Dysregulated, that doesn't happen. We're a bit stuck on or either stuck off in that hypo. So hyperarousal is more of that fight or flight. It's going to be anxiety if you have racing thoughts, restlessness. We see insomnia here, feeling on edge. We also see digestive issues for people who are more in the sympathetic dominance. I would say chronic pain lives more in this sympathetic dominance as well. That's been my experience. People who have a lot of high tension in their body. Hypoarousal is this freeze or this shutdown where we see exhaustion, low motivation, which was something we covered at the beginning of this episode, feeling very stuck. We also see people in hypoarousal or the shutdown state where they feel disconnected from their body and others. There is this avoidance of movement. There's a slowish way about moving. There also can be brain fog. So that would be more of that hypoarousal. And you also would have a poor resilience to stress with a dysregulated nervous system. So you don't recover well from stressors, or you just find you don't handle them well. So I see a lot with my clients, there's a high sensitivity to external stimuli. So they might be really sensitive to different exercises, too much exercise. They might be very sensitive to different supplements or different chemicals or pollutants in the air. Also, with people with dysregulated nervous systems, we'll see they can get either very reactive when something goes wrong. There might be rage, there might be intense anxiety, even if they're just internalizing it. It's still an experience they're having. They might immediately and consistently go to worst case scenario when a stressor occurs. Or on the other side, in that hypoarousal, we'll see stressors will make them shut down. They'll start to dissociate where they feel checked out from their body. They'll experience a depersonalization where they feel not quite here in reality. They almost feel like they're in this dream state and not in a good way. And they'll feel more flatlined. So I want to mention here too is that feeling things like anxiety, anger, even exhaustion are not wrong to experience or inappropriate necessarily. Doesn't mean if you experience those things, you have a dysregulated nervous system and you're sensitive to stressors. You can be regulated and angry. When there's true dysregulation, what we see is I call it losing your bananas. You lose your bananas, or I call it sometimes falling off the edge, or you fall off the cliff. You aren't able to steady or regulate yourself, even in the stress and in the peak emotions or the intensity of that moment. You sort of lose yourself. I'm sure you've experienced at least somebody in your life at some point losing their bananas, or maybe you have. That's a dysregulation of the nervous system. So, which brings us back to fitness. So, training is a stressor. So if we're sensitive from stressors because of a dysregulated nervous system, because of trauma or chronic stress, then that's going to impact our results. That's going to impact our motivation. That's going to impact our ability to train intensely, which we would need at some level in order to adapt and get stronger and build a healthy, fit physique. So we need the capacity to be able to train. That's a lot of the work that I do with clients is we're building their capacity, we're building their window of tolerance in order for them to tolerate more exercise and intensity. And also do this in a way that's healthy. Exercise in a way that does not harm our mental health, which is typically where women come into fitness because of maybe a history of trauma or sexual abuse or even self-abuse to their own bodies. They come into fitness and they can be quite aggressive on their body. They don't have a good, healthy relationship with exercise and fitness. So, what I was going to share with you in this episode are a few of the most common coping mechanisms and manifestations of trauma and chronic stress that I've seen with women. I did this talk many years ago in Virginia. I got flown out to do this talk and I loved presenting it. It was at a women's retreat and I looked back on my notes and I said, this is still so relevant. So here are the most four common kind of coping mechanisms that I've seen in my female clients when they've experienced trauma, when they have a dysregulated nervous system. So let's see where you fit in, if at all, and see what we can do about it. Number one, dominate. When women want to dominate their bodies and control our body out of fear, out of anxiety, feeling like you're not enough and you're trying to control your body, this is very common for women who have a history of disordered eating. I see a lot of women coming in who have a eating disorder history, and historically they've tried to dominate their body. They've tried to control things in order to get the outcome they want or to really have some sort of safety, sense of control. We see this often in women who have experience with sexual trauma, or even if they have experience of emotional trauma as well. They have almost this fear-driven discipline. They feel like they can't trust themselves or their body. They need to be really rigid in the way that they're controlling their food and their exercise. And then maybe that will give them the safety. Maybe then they'll be enough. We see that very, very commonly. So a few questions to ask yourself to see if this is where you fall in to this pattern. Do you routinely push your body even when deep down you know you need to scale back and rest? That's relevant even not in the context of fitness, but in general. Do you routinely push yourself in your body even when you know you need to rest? You're trying to control your body and push yourself. Do you feel like you need to rigidly control your food, your exercise, or other aspects around your body because you fear that you'll spiral out if you don't, or something bad is going to happen if you don't control? Number 3, do you feel shame or guilt around your body that prompts degrading or damaging self-talk? We see that as well with women who try to dominate and control their bodies. They'll have a lot of negative self-talk about themselves, so they try to really control and push themselves. So I say we want to go from dominating to collaborating. Dominate to collaborate. So building a healthy relationship with your body, reevaluating your relationship to diet and exercise, starting to move into movement from a perspective of this is good for me, this is healthy for me, this is a form of self-love, rather than using exercise or diet as a form of punishment. Now, doing that is a whole nother conversation, right? Easier said than done. But essentially, that is at the core of this is really being able to trust your body and moving towards diet and exercise, not from this punishment mindset. I'm also going to drop in a little secret word today. I didn't mention at the start of this particular episode, but every episode I drop in a secret word somewhere. And if you collect at least 8 of these secret words, you save them and you send them over to me, it will give you 10% off our comprehensive feminine strength training and nutrition program. So the secret word today in this episode that you'll want to collect and save is banana. The secret word is banana. Okay, number 2. We see this often. Our women will try to destroy their body. Oh, I see this so often. I went through this phase as well, destroying your body. So this is for women who have a history or currently are killing themselves in their workout. I was just on a call with a client the other day, and we were talking about intense exercise and how we always felt like we needed to feel like we've been hit by a truck after our workout to feel like it was actually effective. And that's just not true. It is so not true that it's actually making us worse off. So women we see in this category of destroying their bodies often will have adrenal dysfunction, or they might be in the beginning stages of adrenal dysfunction because they can still destroy their bodies after too long. Like my experience, your body just shuts down and you're not able to work out anymore. So usually women in this category, they're in the beginning stages of adrenal dysfunction. We see also women here with chronic pain, complex chronic pain. They're just beating up their body constantly. Again, trying to control the outcome really rigidly. There's this fear-driven discipline and control. They train more what we call distress training rather than a eustress training. Eustress is a positive stressor, a stressor that we can recover from and adapt and get better. Distress is a stress that's breaking us down, and we're just pushing and pushing and pushing. So a few questions to ask here on the destroy category. Do you feel like a failure if your workouts don't go perfectly or if you don't follow a workout plan perfectly? Because I see a lot of clients where they want to follow the plan perfectly the way that I prescribed it, and if they don't, they have to push themselves, and that is just not the road we're going down. That is just not the game. Number 2, do you have a hard time slowing down and being easy on yourself? Do you feel compelled to always push harder, even at the expense of your health and energy? So it's very similar to the dominating question. Do you have a hard time slowing down? Do you always want to push? Do you always want to control? And lastly, do you have a complicated relationship to rest? Do you have a complicated relationship to the concept of rest? And also, do you have a complicated relationship to the value that you place on achievement or hard work? We see that also start to manifest in women who have some trauma, is that they really put a lot of value on their achievement, what they're doing, what they can accomplish. And sometimes that will manifest in their fitness. And if they don't hit their certain numbers, then they really beat themselves up. They really take it personally. And then what ends up happening is they push their body too far, too much, and then we see injury, hormonal dysregulation in this destroy category. So what we want to do is go from destroy to actually building. So we want to build the body up, and that can't happen when we're constantly destroying it and pushing our body back down and dealing with injuries constantly. So we want to learn what we call it your 70 to 75% range is. 70-75% range is the intensity in which typically we want to train at on average in your workouts, not 100%, 70 to 75%. We talk about that in more detail in some other videos about how we really don't want to be training to failure. That is how injury happens. We're essentially training failure when we do that too consistently. So instead, we want to build. We want to stay within our body's tolerance, our body's capacity, and almost take a minimalist approach to training. That can be really, really helpful for women who fall into this category who want to destroy, doing less and actually seeing the results from that. Third coping mechanism or way that trauma can manifest in fitness is what I call divide. Ooh, this one's a good one. So this is where we have the tough girl act. This is where we have this shield of I'm a strong, independent woman. I don't need anybody. But underneath, we can feel quite guarded. We can feel a lot of fear, a feeling like we always have to be armored, a feeling like we always have to handle everything ourselves, when that's not necessarily true. It's more of a protective mechanism. We might have high levels of tension in the body. We might always feel like we have tightness inside of us. Our belly might feel really tight, our hips might feel really tight, shoulders, and there might be this deep down feeling that you're not protected and that you're not safe. So we see that in this kind of division. And why I mention this in the context of fitness is that sometimes women will go into strength training and fitness to feel more strong and empowered and like I can handle things. I'm capable, which is great. And it can sometimes manifest in a way where it's actually encouraging more of this guarded energy that can be extremely depleting. So the question here would be, do you lack a fundamental sense of safety and peace in your body? Next question is whether you feel like you have something to prove with your independence or your strength. So if you feel like you're trying to prove something either to yourself or to somebody else with this independence, with this empowering strength. And then lastly, are you comfortable setting boundaries around how people treat you? So sometimes we can have this armoring, this guarding, because we don't feel like we can set our boundaries or we don't feel like the people in our life are going to respect our boundaries. And then that can manifest as this guarding. So I mention this again in the context of fitness because women can go into fitness putting on this armor, feeling like they have to get strong and tough, when sometimes that can just re-encourage this energy of guarding. So instead of division, we want to move towards connection. We want to move toward connection. This is a call for vulnerability here. We want to find opportunities to soften. When I say soften, that can mean different things for different women, but essentially what I mean here is being aware of unnecessary tension of your body and being able to relax and soften and relax and quiet things down and recognize when you don't have to be so guarded. We could talk forever about this subject as well, but just throwing that out there, this is a very common manifestation of women who have trauma, usually physical or sexual trauma, unfortunately. Last one here that we see is disembody. This is more of a manifestation for those who are in that shutdown phase. So we see a disconnection to the body. We see a dissociation, meaning that they feel checked out from their body. I often hear clients say, I don't feel anything from the neck down, or they feel like they're just going through the motions. This can also occur from women who have experienced physical or sexual trauma. They struggle to feel safe under physical stress. So there may be this overwhelm or this shutdown with intensity, like we mentioned earlier, where intense exercise can bring up all sorts of weird somatic or bodily sensations that don't really seem to correlate with the exercise. There can also be some body shame here as well. So a lot of shame around what our body looks like, what it feels like. There can also be a disconnection with certain or particular body parts. So some women will feel quite disconnected from their stomach area or their pelvis, depending on what's happened to them in their past. And we also can see in the shutdown phase, in this disconnect phase, this disembodied phase, that there's a deep resistance to doing exercise. Exercise doesn't feel good, so why would we want to do it? And we feel so checked out, when we feel really uncomfortable with exercise and movement in general, when being in your body doesn't feel good, we're not going to be motivated to do it. There's going to be a deep resistance holding us back. So that's where we see that very strange resistance to doing movement. So a couple other questions we can ask here. Do you have experience physically checking out in stressful situations? And does that manifest in exercise when you're under physical stress, which occurs in exercise, right? Do you often feel like you want to escape your body? And do you have a poor sense of awareness about where your body is in space and its sensations? So sometimes some of us are just a little bit more clumsy, but for people who do have a habit of this dissociation, they don't really sense much of their body in space because of a history of trauma. We see that they're often running into things, their balance isn't as good. They have trouble learning movements, which can also lead to not wanting to move because everything feels so awkward and uncomfortable. So what we want to do instead is we want to move from the space of disembodiment to presence. So external orientation is one way that we do this, that we did in somatic experiencing. I teach external orientation all the time, is just first orienting to the space around us, knowing where we are in space. Sometimes for these individuals, not going to a gym can be really helpful because the external environment can be really stimulating. I personally do not like going to a gym. That's why I have a home gym. I find that gym environments can be really stressful for women who are very uncomfortable with their body. They feel very uncomfortable with movement. So we remove that barrier and we just have them work at home. Internal orientation is another really great drill for people who feel more panicked in their body. This is where we can start to feel ourselves more, so we can externally orient, so we can externally notice what's around us, and then we can start to internally notice how that feels inside of us. What is my breath doing right now? Where are my hips situated on the seat that I'm standing on, or where are my feet on the ground? There's this internal orientation of what's going on inside of us. When I mention the breath, we can notice the breath. Often for people in dissociation, changing the breath, telling them take a deep breath, or forcing yourself to take a deep breath isn't often the most beneficial, instead of just noticing, not trying to change anything about what you notice, not trying to judge anything. You're just noticing what's in my environment, what can I see and notice, and internally what is going on inside of me. So those who disembody and disconnect would do really well from that 70-75% intensity range as well. So that's where we can, what's called, titrate the experience. So we're doing just enough where we get that adaptation, but not enough where we're starting to get that shutdown and that overwhelm from the intensity. Right? So we're only doing what the body can actually handle, moving at the pace of the nervous system. This is especially critical with the clients who have complex chronic pain. They have autoimmunity where we see high systemic inflammation. We have to move at the pace of the body. We have to slow down. So those are the four main manifestations that I see when women have trauma and how it manifests in their fitness. We see that they want to dominate or intensely control their body and control their fitness and their exercise and their diet. We see that they want to destroy their body. They want to beat their body up. Often there's a lot of shame around their body or who they are. They want to divide themselves from others and get really empowered and strong and capable and handle everything themselves, but they're doing so from an unhealthy space, from a place that's actually stressing them out more. And then lastly, this disembodiment, where we see this disconnection from the body and sensations. We see them checking out and not able to handle much exercise and feeling super awkward with it in general. So we can experience all of these things or just some of these things. So it can be a range, and we can normalize these things. That's why I want to do this episode, is if you're experiencing any of these things, this is unfortunately normal and things that we can move through. Most women have a complicated relationship to diet and exercise and their bodies. It's just has to do for a lot of different reasons. In module 1 of our feminine strength program, we address this right off the bat because it is so common, is how can we train and eat in a way that does not provoke past eating disorders, that doesn't provoke past issues with our body image. Really, really important. How can we prioritize sustainability is a really big piece of this. Often women who fall into these categories, they go really hard and fast in certain like 30, 60, 90-day programs where they're going really intensely, but it's not sustainable. And they're on this big ebb and flow going back and forth, but they haven't found a rhythm of actually sustainably building a strong and fit body from a healthy perspective. I'm just thinking of a client now. She had this habit of, she had a lot of body image issues that were coming up for her in the past, and she would go on these more extreme fitness programs where she would drop the weight, but then it wasn't sustainable and she'd gain it back. And then she felt shame about that. And then she didn't want to start back up again. So now we're doing it in a very titrated, sustainable way. She's been with me, I want to say 9 months now, and steady, steady, steady. And that's the game. It's not sensational. It's not like 10 pounds in a month, but it is sustainable. She's able to track her food now without it triggering anything. She's just putting the work in a sustainable way, a few days a week. And it's something that she can do for the rest of her life. And it's working. It's working, and she's dropping the weight gradually in a way that works for her. And that is where we want to get women instead of the big highs and the lows of weight loss and fitness is it can be just part of your life. It can be something that there isn't a lot of emotional attachment to it, we could say. So, as I mentioned earlier of our secret word, I won't say it again, but there's a secret word in this episode. So, if you collect these secret words, at least 8 of them, will give you 10% off the Feminine Strength Training and Nutrition Program. We always ask that you guys apply for a consultation so we can actually have a conversation about whether it's a good fit for you. This is a 6-month training program for women who want to learn how to sustainably build a fit body for life for decades to come, learn the skills without falling back into these unhealthy habits. So I hope you enjoyed this episode on how trauma can impact our fitness, how it can manifest in our bodies. Feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts if you have experience here, if you feel open to share, and otherwise I will see you on the next episode. Thanks, guys.